Well, welcome, everybody. This is the inaugural launch of a new Shindig series on leading voices with higher education. And I am delighted that Scott Jenkins is my first guest. Um, you saw Scott's bio, so I'm not going to go into it very much. Just as a quick background, this series um, came about as a result of my interacting with this lovely lady on the screen, Tara Peitzer. Tara explained what Shindig's possibilities were. They've worked with a lot of higher education institutions and thought that this might be a good experiment for us to try just for the University of Florida and the University of Central Florida. I want to thank Dr. Dale Campbell, who is on, who's the director of the Institute of Higher Education at UF, and Sissy Carroll, I don't know if she's on yet, the dean of the College of Education and Human Development at EF, but they have been strong supporters and encouragers. And this is a bold experiment. Thank you to the lead 2016 cohort that has shown up. Um, I think we get extra credit for I'm just absolutely delighted to start this. We're going to do this at least 6 of them every other Thursday at 5 o'clock. We'll talk about the guests coming up at the end of the program, but right now I want to get into a conversation with Scott. Scott is a proud UCF alumnus, has a incredible background working for Western governors, working in the Bush administration as assistant secretary of the Department of Education, working for Governor Mitch Daniels as an education advisor, Governor John Engler. He's done everything. And Lumina Foundation was smart enough to pick him up several years ago. So, Scott, thank you for joining us. And please, for the folks that aren't familiar with Lumina Foundation, help them understand why you're here.
Great. Thanks, Greg. Thanks for reaching out. And I'm honored and humbled to be your first speaker in this series. It's great to be with all of you tonight. Lumina Foundation is the largest private philanthropy focused exclusively on post-secondary education. Most people know Lumina Foundation through our work of kind of identifying goal 2025, which is a goal that by 2025, 60% of Americans will need some form of high quality post-secondary credential in order to be successful. And so while people call it Lumina's goal, really what it is really what we believe through research and the science that we have that the economy will require. And so we're really just the folks saying, hey, here it's coming, as sometimes I refer to it. The meteorite is coming. If you believe the meteorite is coming, then how do we prepare for it? And how do we do it? And that meteorite is that America needs to prepare and increase its development of talent in the country. In fact, my boss, Jamie Marasotis, wrote a book called America Needs Talent, which refers to that. So what Lumina does is we work in state government, federal government, institutions, communities, and in innovative models to try and encourage the increase in post-secondary attainment in this country.
I failed to mention this is for pretty much everybody in the room. I'm sure this is the first time you've been exposed to Shindig. It is a very interactive platform. It is meant to be that way so that you can engage in questions while we're having this conversation. The easiest way to do that is at the bottom, you will see an icon for raising your hand. That will let Tara know that you have a question, and then she can work with you to either have the question sent via text or to actually bring you up on stage where the rest of us are so that you can ask the question live. So please don't be shy with questions. Scott, how big is Lumina Foundation?
So the foundation itself is the corpus of the philanthropy is around 1.3 billion. We do about 55 million in grant making and support annually to support the mission. The unique thing I think about the foundation is that we, unlike a lot of foundations, are really kind of galvanized around the goal, and that drives our philanthropy. It drives our kind of will building and our work with uh, with leaders across the country. I mean, my particular focus is and I lead a team internally of a couple people, plus an external consulting firm of around 24 people, and that effort is around supporting our state policy work and how things we believe that are happening in state policy that are increasing attainment, but also closing equity gaps and raising the attainment of students of color and low income students.
So you said that the singular goal helps drive the foundation. So does that differentiate you from other foundations that focus on higher education, or how would you describe it?
Yeah, a lot, because and not a lot of philanthropies are involved in policy work. It's a tricky area to involve yourself as a nonprofit foundation because we're prohibited from lobbying. We can provide information, we can provide research, we can fund research, we can have an opinion, and we can share it. But we don't advocate for particular pieces of legislation and things like that. But actually setting a goal and saying by 2025 the core mission of Lumina Foundation is to get America to from somewhere in the mid 40s of attainment up to 60% is really what wakes us up every morning and thinks, how do we really get more Americans across the finish line with a high quality credential that can lead to further education and employment. And a lot of foundations work at a much more removed level. They're a few degrees separated from those things that are going to be kind of direct action. And so while we're not an operating foundation, we tend to be a foundation filled with people who have worked at the state level, at institutional level, at system levels, and at the federal level, as opposed to a foundation that's filled with people who are of philanthropy. So there are a lot of people in this organization that have higher ed degrees, like everyone on the other end of this.
You direct state policy work for Lumina, which means that you've got your finger on the pulse in what all 50 states are doing with respect to having a completion goal. So maybe you can tell us about what your work entails and how things that are happening in the states, are they building off of one another? Are they all trying their own individual experiments? Or are there some
Mm,
best practices that people are taking away that you're helping to facilitate?
sure, great question. So the part of this comes from my background and maybe even my brother's background. I grew up in the Space Coast. So I grew up on Merritt Island. My dad worked for NASA. My brother was is a planetary scientist, and actually um, the one of the principal investigators who found planet 452b, which was the planet that's most like Earth at this point that we found, closest to the sun. And the way we used to do planetary science is we used to listen with big radio telescopes, and if we heard a sound, we SETI would raise the alarm, and we'd make all kinds of great science fiction movies. The way we do it now through technology and other things is we realized that if we were going to look for a planet where life could be sustained, so you had liquid water, distance from the sun, those sorts of measurements, you had to look like for a planet that looked, acted, and was like Earth, so an Earth-like planet. I say that in a long-about way to give you the perspective of how we look at states at Lumina. We look at states as almost like individual planets. There are there's some comparisons that you can make, but we approach this work with great humility. We approach this work knowing that different political culture happens in every state, different higher ed culture, different economies, different budgets, different policies. And so we don't go at it with any kind of hubris that this is, we found one solution, let's do it. And so really the way we think about state policy work is how do we work with these 50 planets to actually make them into planets that can sustain student success policy and budgets that really grow attainment and close equity gaps. And we believe that there are some elements that we found that actually can help to do that. So the way we talk about this when I do presentations, and I really talk about kind of a science fiction or science form of terraforming. So how do we work with states to terraform them into places where you can have good student success? And instead of, I think in a lot of cases, what we've done over the past 30 years and 20 years that I've been involved in this is that we try and take a really cool idea, like articulation and transfer, dual credit, or things like that, and we try and plant those in as many states as we can. But unfortunately, those states might not have an ecosystem or environment that's conducive to that kind of work. And so we want to make sure, you have to make sure that we're working in a way that makes sense in the state, and that we're really trying to change big levers. And what the big levers that we work with, Greg, are we focus on arguing that states really need to set a goal. What are you trying to get towards? So set a goal similar to Lumina. We now have 41 states, including Florida, that has set an attainment goal. And what does that mean? So using your data that you have in the state, what type of credentials do you need to count as part of that goal, that attainment goal? And then looking at your metrics and your dashboards, what types of students and what demographics do you need to move to increase student success to get to that goal? Secondly, we believe finance is across the board one of the largest ecosystem changers in state government and in higher education. And we look at that in three ways. We look, one, first and foremost, how are states looking at all of the resources they have, not just tuition and general revenue appropriations and financial aid, but looking also at other state, federal, local dollars that flow into your post-secondary institutions or can be developed and used to develop talent in your state that may be in different agencies. How are you using TANF funds? How are you using CDBG? How are you using SNAP funds to support students who might otherwise be eligible? So those sorts of things we think are important for states to create that environment. Secondly, we believe that the public dollars that go into public post-secondary education should focus on student success and should focus on outcomes, and making sure that institutions are focusing on their student population and getting those students to a credential, as opposed to what we typically have seen across the country for the last 30 years is really a funding based on enrollment and a funding based on prior practice or base plus type funding, which we know does not create incentives, and is by its nature not creating incentives to get students through. Finally, we believe that these systems need to be affordable, and that we need states to set forth what the expectations of what individuals and families need to pay for their education. So we've created an affordability benchmark, and we think that that is a strong step for a state to articulate, and then making sure that you're driving every available resource into your lowest income students so that they can be as successful as possible. We believe that need-based aid needs to be fairly much more robust in states. We think it needs to be rather and supporting of all students that are low income, regardless of whether they're 18 years old or 40 years old. And when we look across the states, we look for states that are actually opening up opportunities for adults. And then finally, the system as it exists right now, ultimately, we don't think it's serving adult learners and non-traditional learners as well as it should. And we all know from the research that today's student looks a lot different than that student looked 40 years ago. And most students are working part-time, and more opportunities for for innovative models, affordable models that can serve learners that typically are adults or veterans or coming from different walks of life, to provide them an opportunity for a high quality credential as quickly as possible. And so we think all of those things taken together, and they're not really our ideas. These are ideas that like most good state policy, we plagiarize what states are doing that are showing good progress on these types of things. And we've just kind of encapsulated them into our state policy agenda, and hope, and it guides our work, and it supports the work of states as they really go after this problem.
That's great. So that's a good segue to talk about the state policy agenda, but we have a couple of questions actually that have come in. So Tara, if you can put Mitch's question up on screen.
Okay, so I was just curious where you get your funding from.
So about 14 years ago, the foundation was formed from a financial instrument out of USA Funds. And USA Funds was a large student loan lender in Indiana, and these funds kind of existed across the country. And about $700 million was spun off into a nonprofit foundation with the exclusive goal that it would focus on post-secondary education. And so we've grown that initial investment over time. But we are similar to a traditional foundation. We receive money from the corpus of that original investment 13 years ago.
Trace is from Rollins College and is a fellow doctoral student with me.
Oh.
I know he has a brilliant question, but I guess Brittany's going to try to ask a question now.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Wow, nice. Wow. You're driving.
I am, but fortunately I can listen and not have to do too much. Yeah, on the way home from work. But my question was really, you talk a lot about offering these avenues for opportunities for institutions, for leaders to help fund where they have issues, I guess, or maybe that's the way I'm understanding it. But how do you help those leaders who maybe don't recognize that they do have an issue? So I think what I'm talking about is, as our student demographic has changed, you talked about underrepresented students and non-traditional learners. There's a lot of institutions that think they're doing a good job of educating those folks. So how do you maybe help them recognize they aren't in some scenarios? Because that's a very political position, or could be, to take with them.
Well, it's political internal to the institutions also. I think the institutions that we have seen out there that are really going after this, and the institutions, I think actually, if you're not familiar, that Education Trust actually just put out a paper around the institutions that are really closing gaps, and looking at kind of those metrics of how students of color are doing in their institutions. And some of these institutions, like Georgia State, actually have an achievement gap where students of color perform better than white students. And you know, that has not happened overnight. Georgia State has been at this for over a decade, and they have let the data lead their efforts, and they've put in charge of this work kind of your academic leadership and brought the faculty on board around this. So you're looking at, so what are our completion metrics by students of color, by low income students, by program, by course, looking at those courses and seeing how well students do. I think this is something that's emerging more and more, that this awareness that we have a problem is starting to take hold. I give the example sometimes in places like California, where you have some of the best institutions on the planet are there, and you've got a high attainment for Asians and whites in the state. But when you look at Hispanic attainment, 17% of Hispanics have a post-secondary credential in California, yet they make up over 50% of the population. There's no way the math works out to keep their economy straight. And where do those students go by and large? They're going to the community college system, and in some cases they're making it to the Cal State system. But they're not equally represented within UC. So when you look at a state like Florida, where are those students being served? Actually, the research that just came out was that the University of South Florida is actually doing a really good job at addressing the needs of students of color. And I think we've got to be able to point to those instances where it's happening and try and replicate it. But we talk a lot in our outcomes-based funding work where we say that students or that institutions should be supported based on their mission. When and institutions leaders, you go, oh, that's great. Our mission is, we're a research one institution with a high, and what we say is no. Your mission is the student population you serve. So the aspirational mission of the academic leadership or the brand, what I call the brand leadership of the institution, it should take a second tier to the student population that you need to serve, and making sure that those students are moving through.
Mm-hmm. Cool, thanks. By the way, I just got home, so no worries. I'm looking at the camera because I've arrived. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Things you learn. So, okay. So that was great context, Scott. So can you talk us through the state policy agenda? I know you have one that runs 2017 to 2020. If you look on the bottom left part of the screen, there's a link there, and you can click it to get a copy of the agenda. You've got some pretty audacious goals.
Yeah. So when I talked briefly, I kind of hit the high spots of the state policy agenda, and I'll do a couple of deep dives into it, but won't belabor the point around everything. The state policy agenda is really how we kind of look at what's going on across the state, and you all can see it at a macro level. The audience for this is folks like you all, institutional leaders, SHIO staff, higher ed policy staff, governor staff, and things like that. Underneath this, we have a document that we call kind of elements of strong policy. So for a state to adopt an attainment goal that meets what we see as good criteria, and kind of the criteria that we see in states, that goal has to kind of meet several things. It has to be a challenging, it has to measure, it has to be measurable. It has to be tied to a specific date. It has to be insistent about achieving equitable outcomes and results. And that's not the easiest thing to do, because a lot of times, people will come forth and say, oh, yes, we have a goal, but it really doesn't kind of get at that. And then it might not be codified in a way that influences state policy, influences budget, influences institutional decision making. So I'll give you the example of a state like Tennessee that has had a mature kind of attainment goal for a long time. And it's called, they said the goal at 55%, similar to Florida, and it's called Drive to 55. And they have used that goal as kind of the overarching principle around everything they do in their state. Their outcomes-based funding is driven around the fact that we need to get to this goal. Their work around doing pre-college FAFSA completion and having the number one FAFSA completion rate in the country is because they're trying to get to this goal. Their Tennessee Promise work, their Adult Reconnect work, all of this is under this broader goal of these are the things we're going to do to get to the goal, and everything we do contributes to getting to that goal. And if it doesn't, then it goes under a much greater scrutiny. We also believe that state data systems that are out there in a lot of cases need to improve dramatically to support this type of activity, to make sure that decision makers can make decisions based on data systems that actually provide good actionable research. I talked a little bit about investing in talent, which is kind of the talent finance plans, which is using all your resources to support talent development. But I'll talk a little bit about our outcomes-based funding, because there's a lot of research that's been coming out around that, both some work that says it works, some work that says it doesn't. What we're trying to get at here is that state policymakers and budget makers need to be intentional about what signals they're sending to post-secondary education. And what we believe is that you should have a post-secondary funding formula that aligns to your state attainment goal. and how it supports that goal, and is measuring kind of equity and workforce goals around that, because we think that finance documents are policy documents. I used to be on both. I've served on both a standing committee as staff, and then in a governor's office doing budget work. And I can tell you that most state universities, while they're interested in what law you pass, what statute you pass, and what reports you have to file, they know that you're by and large really committed to the money, and they know that the finances drive things. So how do you create incentives that do the right, that signal the right type of behavior, that don't create more or perverse incentives to expand gaps? So how do you really focus on raising the attainment through your funding formula around serving the students you have, and making sure that you're serving low income and students of color at a much greater rate than you are currently? And then it has to be a large enough amount that actually changes people's behavior and how they think about this work. Right now, a lot of times we're looking at a range of anywhere from 5 to 10% in some states. In some states, it's even up to like 80 or 90%. It doesn't take a lot of money, but it takes recurring money built into the base that is, in some cases, at risk. And then with that, the other side of this too, and one of the concerns people have is that, and I'll use Florida as an example. Florida sets a very low threshold in a proxy for Pell eligibility within its performance funding methodology. We don't actually believe that Florida's funding formula and outcomes-based funding kind of meets the criteria of what we would say can really change good behavior. We think there's some things in it that could be improved, and there's some folks having conversations about that in Tallahassee now. But for example, you have institutions that by and large are majority white institutions that receive a Pell bonus because of Pell eligible students set at a 30% threshold. And in some cases, you have institutions that have a 50 or 60% Pell eligibility threshold that get the same incentive for crossing that finish line. And what we would argue is that it is much harder as an institution to serve a proportion of students that come from low income and also come from other types of situations that make it that provide a higher complexity for the institution and a higher complexity for that student to do well in that, because there are so many other competing demands for their efforts, and the resources need to flow along those lines. So that's really what we're getting at around those lines, and those are kind of the two big issues that are percolating now during legislative sessions and stuff is around kind of what is our goal going to be, how do we fund this, and then how do we provide the kind of supports to low income students to ensure their success. Different types of models around low income supports that are beyond financial aid. So how do we provide creating a food pantry, creating opportunities at the institutional level that you could provide emergency financial aid and assistance and things like that. Florida's in a tricky situation in some cases because you're a low tuition state with a relatively low financial aid profile. But that doesn't stop it from being very expensive for students to have an apartment or to live in a house and travel to campus and things like that. So those costs of living can sometimes be as or more of a barrier than the tuition and fees that a student pays. And so we think that state policy should address that and be aware of that and should drive dollars that direction.
And I appreciate you talked about SHIA as the State Higher Education Executive Officers. And I want to have you talk about Lumina's relationship with SHIO. But I think Rachel had another question to ask us.
You're on.
Go ahead, Rachel.
Okay. My question was, are you involved in any way with producing or making available open educational resources?
Not in the production or content production side. What we have worked on more around supporting the types of institutions and the type of work that goes into kind of that. One of our investments that we have made a long time ago was around we did an institutional investment around Western Governors University, which is a competency-based university that is expanding and mostly serves adults. The open educational resources we have not been that engaged in.
Can you talk a little bit about the longitudinal data systems and how states are using those, or how states are even funded?
Yeah, so states have been investing in longitudinal data systems for decades, and federal government has provided them at the K-12 level, and through the Workforce Investment Innovation Act, which is the WIA, the workforce dollars. There has been a workforce longitudinal data system initiative also. The work around these has progressed pretty well. Florida is pretty well known for a really strong longitudinal data system that can yield a lot of really good data. What we try and look at and what we're seeing across the country is more and more of the ability to link K-12 data systems with post-secondary data systems, and then workforce, and then on to kind of other types of state data systems where you can then understand the flow of students into and through the system. But that kind of gives it a wrong perspective of being very longitudinal, which we all know this may be longitudinal, but it's not chronological. So you may have someone coming into the data system in post-secondary, but they went to a school in Indiana, but they're now in Florida. So more and more people are calling for longitudinal systems that actually are a little bit more robust at the federal level. At the state policy level, and the work we're doing is we're really trying to just encourage states to create a unit record system that is based on a student. And a lot of times we're very system oriented, and we want to capture this aggregate data and things like that. But there are a lot of cases where the state, in a lot of cases, doesn't collect all the data that they could on an individual student, and then allow that kind of unit data to march through the system and just basically hang information off that unit record. One of the things that we call for is that we need data systems that make sure that they incorporate all kinds of credentials, not just post-secondary credentials like an associate degree or a bachelor's degree or something like that. That if a student or a resident of the state receives a credential from a Microsoft certification from a third-party provider, that then becomes part of their kind of educational record, and can be then aggregated so that you can. So if you're looking at this from a governor's office or an economic development office, you actually know what the talent pool has in your state, because right now there's a little bit of guesswork that goes on by mining LinkedIn data, BLS data, other types of data. And so we're really trying to work with a couple of innovative states and finding more states, Florida's being one, that is really interested in building out more robust data systems where you have a lot more interagency agreements. Because I can tell you right now in Florida, if you're an underemployed worker and you want to go to a work one center or one stop center, and you say, hey, listen, I took 30 credit hours at Seminole Community College 15 years ago, and I graduated from Merritt Island High School with a 3.5 GPA. Can you pull up that information and tell me what I should do? They'd go, no, because the Department of Education won't release your data to us, and we have no idea how to get in touch with the Seminole Community College registrar or their people to get you that data. So with a more robust longitudinal data system, you could actually help people to make decisions about what they can do with their life. So it's not necessarily all just about kind of government and how do we spend resources better, how do we target resources better. It's also about the individual ability to have access to your own data that you earned, that is sitting in some spreadsheet somewhere, that if you could have access to, you could quantify it and qualify it and then grow on it. So a lot of our policy work is built around kind of focusing on students and where the barriers or accelerators are within state policy that can get that student into the workforce with a high quality degree that leads to further education and employment.
Terrific. We have another question from Shandon, I believe. Tara, can you bring her up?
Who at Northern Illinois University, you can get a little bit of the snow here.
Yeah.
So my question is, I'm sorry, I'm walking on campus. I appreciate you talking about the performance-based funding and how we should take into account of the kind of the equitable outcome there. One quick commercial is I have a piece that's coming out from community college review. We look at Louisiana's performance-based funding and found that after implementation, actually, low-income student serving institutions are awarding fewer associate degrees, but not certificate. It's just associate degrees. So when you're thinking about the rate of return, it means something, right? So for Louisiana, they have a really strange performance-based funding formula.
Yeah, we wouldn't. Yeah. Oh,
right?
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah.
So they link like tuition setting authority to it as well. And we also look at that and found that it increases community colleges tuition. That's not good. I think it's, the research is providing some sort of evidence, what is working, what's not working. It's too general for us to say, oh, PBF doesn't work or it works. It's really the details, the metrics, what's working, what's not. So my question is, how would you communicate with like the state policy makers and let them know this is not working? This is something you need to think about in the future. For us, Illinois, we have 1%. That's like nothing. Nobody is investing anything for that 1%. And it's just frustrating, how like for researchers, how should we communicate that?
Well, it's brilliant. It's a brilliant question, because what we would say is that I would not even put Louisiana on a spectrum of having an outcomes-based funding methodology that meets our criteria. I would say they have a funding formula that distributes dollars in the way you describe it. And I think I don't know if your paper's done, but in your paper, you may want to make the distinction that people might call, this is a funding formula, and the elements of the funding formula, when it's applied in this way, create these problems. Because I think what happens is we start to name these things. We name things outcomes-based funding, and then all of a sudden, everything's outcomes-based funding. And in a lot of cases, they're not, as you're encountering, because outcomes-based funding the model of this is something that actually results in a change in behavior for the better for students. And we think there's some elements of that. So when we've had conversations in Louisiana around funding, and if you've been looking at their funding, it's a bit tricky. I mean, the TOPS program is looking like it's in dire straits. They have a merit-based financial aid program, which basically does a fabulous job of allowing LSU to raise its tuition up as high as it wants to, while compensating for middle and upper income people who can pay that. And honestly, it's unfair. And this is probably recorded and things like that. But I would say that in Louisiana, the resources that because of a merit-based financial aid system that they have there, the dollars by and large don't flow to low-income students who need the resources, and those low-income students are enrolled in the very institutions you're studying. And so what I think as a researcher, it is a tricky conversation, because a lot of times you all when you read the research on outcomes-based funding, I think it's really telling that it's now starting to move towards what are the end results, and how do you mitigate against bad results. One little plug on Illinois, the kind of the dilemma in Illinois with your funding difficulties is around your pension program. And so by and large, your largest pension issues are not in the regional institutions and the smaller institutions that are providing the education to low-income students and underserved student populations, the bailout of the pension is going to your big research institutions and supporting that, and then it's eating the amount of general revenue dollars that could go spread across the system. And so it then creates this spiral of funding downward that really puts your smaller and regional institutions at risk, whereas your larger institutions that are more well-funded and more research-oriented are not held harmless, but they're not hurt as much, especially not because of the student populations they serve. But I think your other point about researchers is advocate for what's right. Advocate for the system you want to see in the future, because you're going to lead this work. I'm going to be long gone in 20 years, and some of you all might be too. But we need to lead this work. We have institutions and systems and states that build institutions to serve people that look like me and people that look like my kids. That's not the population in 20 years. And we have institutions that were never built to serve these populations. And if you think of our public education system, our K through 12 system in this country, think of it 40 years ago, and then think of it today. It was built 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago for a student population that doesn't serve in the urban sector or even in the rural sector. And those institutions weren't ready to do that. And they're now going through a huge transformation. You all are going to see that transformation happen in post-secondary education. And either you're going to lead it and lead it to a good place, or we're going to see more and more of the disintegration of public post-secondary education to be seen more as a private good and not a public good. All right, soapbox over, done.
I think, Scott, put another way is, if you're not at the table, you're on the table, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, Dean Carroll, I think you had a question you wanted to ask.
It's a great question. Do you do work that supports or bridges pre-K-12 education, post-secondary education, both data gathering on student performance and addressing barriers? This is a question we get all the time, and this is the kind of the nature of being in around being a almost exclusively post-secondary education focused foundation. And our work is that we do not do a lot of work on transitions anymore. And most of that is a lot due to the fact that when you set a goal that's 2025, the year 2025, 60%, and it's 25-year-old to 64-year-olds, if you're a 17-year-old, no matter how you're doing, you're not going to be in our metric. You're not going to be 25 in time to meet ours, because we're so close to the goal. And so we're focused exclusively on post-secondary education. Some of that is hard for some people to take, but there are a lot of institutions and foundations that do focus on K-12 and focus on K-12 and transitions. Ford Foundation, Gates Foundation dramatically. The place where we're focused on a lot more, and there's not a lot of people in this space, is really around adults. And how do we get adults a high quality credential that's affordable and quickly as possible? And secondly, there's not a lot of people other than kind of at the more philosophical stage. We're starting to focus on incarcerated. We're really going after those priority populations that have some post-secondary education but no credential, or have no post-secondary success. So we're doing a lot of work with programs that are even programs that are getting adults that may have dropped out of high school. How do you get a high school credential and a post-secondary credential in rapid succession or in parallel, so that you can go out and find a family sustaining wage, but also go on to further education? So it's one of the areas where we've kind of drawn a line, at least for now, around our work, and it does keep us focused pretty exclusively in kind of the space I described.
Scott, I know we've got a hard stop soon, so I want to just touch on a couple things real briefly. One is Lumina Foundation just published their 2018 update to Aspire Nation. And for those who have not seen it, it is a fantastic report, rich with data in terms of metrics. And Scott, I know we don't have a lot of time to go into in depth, but can you talk about Florida's performance with the Stronger Nation and what we should take away from that?
Yeah, sure. So Stronger Nation is our kind of annual report to the country. We set our goal and how are we doing on that goal. A few years ago, we added within our calculation, we added not just associate degrees and baccalaureate degrees or degrees, but we added certificates, and we created a model by which we could kind of assess where a state was with its creation of these sub-associate level credentials, these certificates, and that by including that as those types of credentials that meet our definition of high quality, that have transparent learning outcomes and lead to higher more education and employment. Florida saw a significant jump in their attainment rate. The one thing that you'll note within it is we break out by race and ethnicity, and you'll see that there are significant gaps in race and ethnicity in Florida, where it really, hopefully, is a clarion call to increase the attainment of Hispanic and African American students. We talk a lot. We've moved the conversation around equity. In fact, we recently put out an RFP for institutions that are looking at doing some work in equity, and that's on our website. That the deadline's coming up soon. But basically, it was a call to the country to say, hey, we want your best ideas on how do you talk about equity and diversity and inclusion and things like that. But having a conversation around race and in states and moving beyond income is not always an easy conversation. We especially with policymakers, they tend to be very comfortable in an income space, talking about low income students, poor students, and that area. But when we start talking about race, that's a bit of trickier. But we have a lot of data that shows that if you focus first among equals on race, then low income students benefit, adults benefit across the board. And we think that so often when we work with our states, and I think the Stronger Nation report shows this, that starting to look at those demographics and where your state sits is very helpful in guiding policy. And you'll notice in the report, when you look at Florida, you can also look at it by county. You can look at it by metropolitan area. You can compare it to other states. You can compare it to other places, compare it to the nation, and things like that. So we encourage policymakers to use it. In fact, I have lots of kind of state policymakers who call me and say, hey, is Stronger Nation out? We want to use that data. We found some interesting things with Florida, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say that, from 2012 to 2016, Florida has increased attainment pretty good. I mean, it's above the national average in its increase in attainment. It's almost at 2% in its increase in attainment. And the good news is you've actually decreased the gap by almost 1%. Your attainment gap, and so what that means is that you've got the policies in place, you've got your institutions working in a way that is not just increasing attainment, not nearly at the rate you need to be increasing attainment, but you must be doing something right, because that attainment is also raising the attainment of students of color within the state, and that's a good thing, because there are other states. I can give you an example of another state that had an astronomical growth, like a 3.4% growth in attainment from 2012 to 2016. But while it was growing at that rate, its gap was widening by the same amount. And so there are some things that we got to dig in and look at that. So Florida is on the right track with regard to that. It just needs to do it times 100 and really increase that. You've got nearly 3 million people in the state with some college and no degree. It's just there's a lot of opportunity to expand.
So you talked about the equity gap, but when you look at it by county, of the 67 counties in Florida, you've got a high of 56% in Leon County in the state capital with having a degree or credential. And you've got a low of 11.6% in DeSoto County. And so how does a state function with that kind of a with a chasm, really, in terms of post-secondary attainment amongst its population.
Well, what a lot of states are doing is actually looking at economic development and the economics of regions and counties, and so how do you go into DeSoto or Polk or whatever county you might be looking at, Liberty, and say what's the workforce look like here? Clearly, it's from a post-secondary credential space, it's very low. What are the jobs now? What are the jobs of the future? And then how do we align that training and workforce development so that we can get to that point? And in some cases, the Florida's kind of a good news, bad news story. Is you're a state that has Jacksonville, you have Orlando, you have Tampa, St. Pete, you have the I-4 corridor, you have Fort Lauderdale, you have Miami, you have these huge metropolitan areas that have big dynamic economies, big dynamic universities and community colleges and lots of education and things like that. And so that also is part of the dynamic, because even though you might have a rural community, the educational challenges that are faced by folks living in rural Liberty or rural county in the state, the same challenges are actually in a lot of the urban centers. That if you're living in downtown Miami, you might have just as much difficulty getting to a post-secondary institution because you don't have a car and you don't really have a reliable mass transit system that can really get you there the way you need to. Or if you live in Jacksonville, you definitely don't. And so we try and think, you have to really think holistically about this type of situation, and make sure that your institutions are responding to the students based on their need and and directing them in a way to the education they need for their particular economy and their community.
All right, and so in the last minute, Scott, since this has been tremendous, have to ask you as a proud UCF alumnus, how do you go from playing in the Fountain to playing in Indianapolis with Lumina? How'd that route go?
Well, if you looked at me as a data point, I was political science major. I worked in politics. I think the direction I took was into state government. I went to Tallahassee right out of undergrad. Worked for the House Higher Education Committee. Did policy analysis there. It was kind of built for me. I'm kind of good at that, and learned how to count votes and just work through that. And then opportunities kind of just approached me and came through. I mean, you listed off my resume, and most people would look at that and go, "Man, you can't keep a job." So I hope that I finally landed in a place, and where I'm at right now is a good place to kind of keep this work going, and work that I've done in states. How do we accelerate it and make it happen? So it's been a fun journey, and it continues on.
Well, you're a tremendous asset for Lumina and for all of us that work in state policy. And I can't thank you enough for being the first guest and helping us understand what's in front of us in terms of the states. The next Shindig is going to be on March 1st. And it's going to have Scott Jenkins, who is the editor of Inside Higher Ed, somebody known to many of us, and as the Higher Education Act reauthorization stuff, I'm sure he'll have a lot to say about it. But Scott, thank you again. Thank you very much. Thank you to all my classmates and colleagues at UF and UPF. And we will see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you all. Have a great night.
Thank you, Tara.